An Apache girl's husband died. Her in-laws threw her out with a newborn until a rancher gave her land. The desert had a way of making sorrow look endless. Each grain of dust carried silence. Each shadow of mesquite stretched long, like a memory refusing to die. On a road that was no more than a strip of earth pressed thin by hooves, a woman walked. Her bare feet carried her without pause, though her body bent with fatigue. In her arms she held a bundle wrapped in torn cloth, and from that bundle rose the faint, quivering cry of a newborn. Her eyes, dark, fierce, lined already by grief, remained fixed on the horizon. She was only 25, yet loss had pressed years upon her face. Just days before, her husband had been lowered into the earth. The earth took him as though it had been waiting all along, swallowing his youth, his laughter, his strength, leaving her with nothing but the child he never had the chance to hold. Among her people, the death of a husband could unravel a woman's place. Among her in-laws, bitter with pride, she was no longer seen as wife, but as burden. They cast her out from their lodge, as if grief itself made her impure. Their words still burned in her ears, sharp as broken glass. Go. Take the child. Do not return. She had begged for a place near the fire, at least for the child's warmth. They turned their backs and left her standing in the cold. So she walked. Through thirst and hunger, she walked. Her daughter slept fitfully in her arms, lips pressed to her mother's skin in search of milk. The woman whispered lullabies in her tongue, though her throat was dry as stone. Her steps faltered, but she did not stop. Each step was for the child. It was along this barren stretch that he found her. The rancher had been riding his land at the edge of dawn, reins slack in his hand, hat pulled low against the rising sun. 33 years old, his frame carried the heaviness of a man who had worked the land alone. His spread was vast, the kind neighbors called too much for one soul. But he had no wife, no children, no one to walk the long halls of his home. Silence had been his companion, and though it kept him company, it gnawed at him like a wolf at the edges of his heart. He noticed her first as a wavering figure in the heat shimmer, a woman bent under a weight. He might have ridden on, for strangers on the road were common, but then the cry of the child cut through the air. A sound small as a bird, yet urgent enough to pierce his chest. He drew nearer. The woman turned sharply when she heard the horse. She pulled the child tighter against her, her gaze a shield. Dust clung to her hair, to the folds of her dress, but her eyes held defiance, the kind born of someone who had already lost much and would not surrender what little remained. The rancher slowed his horse, raising one hand palm outward, as though to assure her he carried no harm. He dismounted with unhurried steps. "You look worn through," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of someone unused to speaking much, but careful when he did. She said nothing. Only her breathing betrayed the strain. His eyes moved to the child. The bundle stirred, a weak cry slipping out. He knelt slightly, lowering himself to her height. From the pouch at his saddle, he brought a canteen and extended it toward her. For a long moment, she did not move. Pride held her still, suspicion anchoring her feet. But then the infant whimpered again, lips pressing in search of what her body could not give. Her hand trembled as she reached for the canteen. She drank first, slow, cautious, letting the water run down her parched throat. Then she tipped a few drops against the baby's lips. The child stirred, eyelids fluttering, and the smallest sigh left her tiny mouth. Relief washed across the mother's face, though she hid it quickly. The rancher watched silently. In her presence, he felt something stir, an echo of years past, of a younger heart that once beat faster at the sight of a girl with eyes like deep earth. He knew her, not by name, but by memory. She had been near his thoughts long ago, when he was a youth lingering at the edges of her people's camp, trading, watching, yearning. But life had carried them apart. Now she stood before him again, altered by grief, yet unmistakable. "You have far to go?" he asked. Her gaze lowered to the child. "Nowhere left," she whispered. The words settled heavy between them. He looked out at the horizon, at the endless dust that gave no promise of shelter. No one could survive it with a babe in arms. "My place is near," he said after a moment. "There's food, shade. You'll rest there if you'll allow it." She hesitated, torn between mistrust and need. She had been cast out once already. Could she risk another door closing on her? Yet the child stirred again, whimpering. She nodded once, curt, as if agreeing only for the sake of the baby. He led his horse alongside as she walked, but soon her legs wavered. Without a word, he offered his hand. Her eyes narrowed, but she accepted, allowing him to lift her onto the horse. She cradled the child to her chest, and together they rode slowly toward the ranch. The land opened before them, wide fences, grazing cattle, a house that stood sturdy against the wind. The woman studied it with guarded eyes. To her it seemed both fortress and prison, though she could not yet tell which. Inside, the air was cooler, shaded by thick beams. He set bread and milk on the table. She fed carefully, breaking the bread into tiny pieces, dipping them in milk to soften, pressing them to her lips before giving any to the child. Each gesture revealed not just hunger, but fierce protectiveness. The rancher watched, offering nothing more than quiet. His nature was not to press, but to give space. She seemed to recognize it, for she relaxed enough to let her shoulders lower. Days unfolded like pages. She remained, at first with the caution of a bird ready to fly at the slightest sound. Yet each day, trust grew by the smallest degrees. She swept the floor without being asked, mended a shirt she found torn, tended the fire when it burned low. He noticed these acts, though he said little. He offered kindness in return, setting milk where she could reach it without asking, leaving water near the bed where she laid her child, patching the leaks in the roof above her room. Their exchange was quiet, almost wordless, yet more binding than any promise. Whispers reached town before long. A wealthy rancher keeping an Apache widow under his roof. Tongues wagged, some with scorn, others with curiosity. He paid them no mind. For him, the decision had already been made. She would not leave, not cast out again. One evening, as the sun sank in copper light, he stood with her outside the house. The child slept in her arms, cheeks round with the health that had begun to return. The silence between them was not heavy now, but waiting. "You need more than rest," he said finally. "You need standing. A name in this place. Protection that won't vanish." She looked at him, eyes sharp with both hope and fear. "And how is that given?" "By marriage," he said simply. "To me." The words hung like smoke. She felt the weight of them, the promise and the risk. She had known a husband once and lost him. Could she bind herself again so soon to a man she scarcely knew now? Yet she saw in him something she had not felt in months, constancy. He did not pity her. He offered ground beneath her feet, a home her child would not be torn from. She bowed her head slightly, her voice quiet but firm. For her sake, yes. He nodded once, as though nothing more needed saying. His word was steady, his presence unyielding. And so, beneath a sky streaked in rose and violet, the rancher and the Apache widow were bound. Not by love yet, but by trust and the promise of shelter. Inside the house, the child stirred in her sleep, a tiny hand curling as if grasping for a future she could not name. And thus 3 shadows settled under one roof, fragile but unbroken, the hush of new beginnings stretching gently into the night. Seasons shifted with the patience of the earth. The wide plains stretched green in spring, gold in summer, brittle and sharp in the leaner months. Upon that land the Apache widow and her child began to take root. What had started as fragile survival grew into rhythm, then into life. The house no longer stood silent. It carried the hum of small things, the bubbling of stew left on the hearth, the soft patter of tiny feet learning to stumble across wooden floors, the low sound of a woman's song drifting into the night. The rancher, who had lived with silence as a second skin, found himself pausing often in doorways just to listen. The quiet exchange that began with bread and water had turned into something deeper, something he scarcely dared name. She remained cautious in the beginning, her hands always busy, her eyes watchful. Yet she was no guest. She claimed the place slowly, not by words, but by weaving herself into its work. She hung herbs by the window, patched curtains that had long hung ragged, planted a row of flowers along the porch where only dust had gathered before. And he, without asking, adjusted himself to her rhythm, fetching water where she pointed, sanding a cradle he carved one night in secret and placed by her bed come morning. She did not thank him with words. She touched the wood, ran her hand over its smooth edges, and looked at him with a softness that said enough. The child thrived. Her skin glowed with health, her eyes wide and curious. She grew used to her mother's steady embrace and to the rancher's arms, broad and unfamiliar at first, but soon a place of safety. Sometimes in the still dusk, the rancher would hold the little girl high until she laughed, a sound so bright it startled him. It had been years since laughter had lived here. Now it came in the shape of a child. But shadows never stayed gone. Word traveled quietly at first, then with sharper edges. Her in-laws had heard. They heard the widow lived under the roof of a white rancher, that the child had grown, that she was no longer a ghost clinging to hunger, but a little flame burning bright. Blood ran deep, they said, and the child carried their son's blood. They would come. The woman heard whispers before she saw signs. Her sleep grew restless, her gaze flickering often to the horizon. The rancher noticed. One night, while she sat with the child pressed against her chest, he asked only, "Who do you fear?" She did not answer at first. Then quietly, as though the words themselves might summon them, she said, "His kin. They cast me away, but the child, they will not let her go." The rancher said nothing for a long while. His jaw worked as though grinding stones. Finally, in a voice like oak, he said, "She will not be taken." Days turned into a waiting silence, broken by the rancher's steady work and the woman's quiet strength. Yet beneath it ran tension, the kind that hums before a storm. And then the storm arrived. They came not under cover of night, but in full day, 3 riders cutting across the plain, dust rising behind them like smoke. Faces hard, voices bitter before words even passed, they stopped at the edge of the rancher's yard. The woman stood on the porch, the child clutched to her side. Her breath faltered, but she did not step back. One of the riders, the elder brother, dismounted. His eyes swept over her with disdain before fixing on the child. "Blood of our blood," he said coldly. "She belongs to us." The woman's arms tightened. The child whimpered, sensing the storm in her mother's chest. The rancher stepped forward then, slow, unhurried, but with a weight that pulled the air around him. He stopped between the riders and the porch, his stance wide, his hands calm but firm at his sides. "She belongs here," he said. His words were not loud, but they carried like stone rolling down a canyon. The brother sneered. "You? What claim do you have over Apache blood? Over a child not your own?" The rancher's gaze did not waver. "By vow, by name, by home." He turned slightly, enough that the woman could see the steadiness in his eyes, the kind of steadiness a storm could not move. "I married her. She is wife. The child is ours." A tense silence fell. The riders exchanged glances. The brother's jaw clenched, his hand twitching near the reins as though itching for fight. But the rancher's stillness unsettled him more than any weapon might have. He stood like a man who would not yield even to death. The woman stepped forward then, onto the porch's edge. Her voice, though trembling, carried steel. "You cast me into the dust when I begged for a place by your fire. You turned your faces from me. Do not come now to claim what you abandoned." Her words cut sharper than any blade. The brother faltered, his pride struck. The younger rider shifted, uneasy, as though realizing the truth that lay bare in the air. At last, the elder spat into the dust. "You'll regret it," he muttered, mounting his horse. The others followed, their figures shrinking against a wide horizon until only dust lingered. The rancher did not move until they were gone. Only then did he turn, his eyes softening as they met hers. She still held the child close, but her shoulders eased, the trembling in her hands fading. She looked at him not as stranger, not even as protector, but as something deeper, root, anchor, home. In the quiet after the storm, love revealed itself not in sudden declarations, but in what had already been built. She saw it in the way he had stood before her without hesitation, in the cradle he carved, in the silent meals shared, in the unyielding word hours. He saw it in the fire that lit her voice, in the way she had faced those who cast her out and chosen him instead. That night, as dusk bled into starlight, they sat together on the porch. The child slept in her mother's arms, the air rich with the smell of earth after rain. The woman's voice broke the silence, soft yet certain. "I thought I was nothing when I came here. Cast away. Empty. But you gave me more than land. You gave me a place where I could be seen, where my child could grow." The rancher looked at her then, not with pity, not with yearning, but with the quiet reverence of a man who understood what it meant to lose and to find again. "And you gave me more than silence," he said. "You gave me a home." Her hand found his. Not out of fear this time, not out of need, but choice. It rested there warm and steady, and he covered it with his own. The stars spread wide above them, vast and uncountable, but the world had narrowed to a porch, a woman, a child, and a man. In their smallness, they had built something unshakable. And so the whisper that began as survival grew into a home, strong enough to withstand storm and silence alike. Some stories do not end with triumph shouted loud, but with a hand resting quietly in another's, with a child's breath against the night, with the soft knowledge that one is no longer alone. And to those who listen, who carry wounds, who walk through dust with nothing but hope in their arms, the tale leans close and whispers, home is not riches nor walls, but the place where someone stands firm beside you and calls you theirs. If you felt this tale touch your heart, ride along with us by subscribing. More stories await by the fire.